In pictures. When girls asked who her father was, sometimes Norma Jean said she didn't know, and sometimes said she'd only seen him once, in a photo, and sometimes that her father was Clark Gable, the man in the photo. She said she could tell by his mustache, the way he styled his hair, and the cleft in his chin. He was a much younger man then, after all, as the photo was taken a long time ago, before Norma Jean was even born. She had seen in photographs of her mother, and of Grace too, how a person's face can change over time. It was actually a little scary how someone could stop looking like herself. The girls at school asked to see the photo of Norma Jean's father, but no, that wasn't going to be possible. She felt awfully sorry. Norma Jean wished she could, but she wasn't allowed. The truth was, Grace, her mother's best friend before her mother went away, would have let Norma Jean bring friends over to the house, at least once in a while. But to say she couldn't was a nice way to tell the story and leave off exactly where she wanted. Since even now, as a grown-up practically, or at least getting closer, Norma Jean was still shuffling between homes. Aunt Anna wasn't in the best of health anymore, so Norma Jean had moved to Grace and Doc's house in Van Nuys. Doc was Grace's new husband, and Bibi, Grace's teenage daughter, sort of like a sister to Norma Jean. At least, that's how Grace said Norma Jean ought to think of her. A neighbor boy, or maybe it was okay to call him a man, Jimmy Doherty, drove Norma Jean and Bibi to high school in the mornings, and back again in the afternoons. He drove a black V8 Ford Coupe and lived just down the street. Her mother was a good friend of Grace's. It was his own car that he purchased from nights at the Lockheed plant. He was mostly free during the day and liked to drive around town to impress girls. It was Grace's idea that Norma Jean ought to go to the Christmas dance at Doc's workplace with Jimmy. It was as if Grace were showing Norma Jean how a girl can tell a story by the way she lives. Just invent the story all around herself. It felt to Norma Jean as if probably Grace used to speak to her mother when they were younger in much the same way, inventing a wild, exciting world where practically anything could happen one minute, anything else the next. What Norma Jean needed to do, Grace said, was find a nice boy to marry, because Doc's company might relocate him soon. And if he relocated, Grace and Bibi would leave with him. Didn't Norma Jean want to stay near Hollywood? Why, there was practically a war on, and all the boys would be shipping out and probably wishing for a wife back home to think about and return to. Why not our neighbor boy Jimmy? Grace asked, with a wink. Oh, but Jimmy was her friend, and he was too old, practically a man, whereas Norma Jean was only 15. But you were grown up in all the ways that matter, said Grace. Jimmy was going with another girl, Norma Jean knew, a girl right around his own age, and not 5 whole years younger and in high school like she was. But what Norma Jean told him was how all the wolves honking at her in the morning and calling out their windows made her very nervous, and so she appreciated his letting her ride with him. Bibi, sitting in the back seat, rolled her eyes. With the dance only a week away, Grace said that Norma Jean had to ask Jimmy to take her, but Norma Jean couldn't do it, because she couldn't think of just the perfect way to ask. When it was clear Norma Jean wasn't going to be able to do what Grace told her to do, Grace came out of the house on a Sunday afternoon as Norma Jean and Bibi were exiting Jimmy's coupe. She approached the window and asked on Norma Jean's behalf whether Jimmy wouldn't be willing to take her to the dance, since she needed someone responsible to look after her. It was about the most embarrassing thing, and Norma Jean guessed her face probably showed it, with the expressions a total jumble, reeling through every possible outcome at once. Oh, she needed a chance to prepare herself for a moment like that. How can a girl possibly make a pretty picture when she feels so many different things at once? Jimmy said, yes, sure. He wouldn't mind. Over the next several nights, Grace instructed Norma Jean on just how to dance with him, where she ought to place her body in relation to his. She asked Norma Jean to practice the steps with her and said, "No, closer, closer. Yes, that way, so you're very close," as Grace's husband, Doc, looked on with an expression that made Norma Jean feel kind of nauseated. When it was time for a slow number, Grace said, "Why, Norma Jean ought to rest her cheek on his chest in the way she would show her." And so Norma Jean did as she was shown, and in front of the eyes of all the adults in the professional world, tall, wide-chested James Doherty danced with her in a perfectly patient and doting way. Norma Jean moved close to him just as Grace said she should, and for as long as Grace said she should, maybe longer. Less than a week later, a for sale sign planted on their front lawn, Grace invited Jimmy and his mother over for a visit. Right in front of Norma Jean, she asked him whether he didn't want to marry Norma Jean, being that Grace and Doc and Bebe were leaving town. Since he, Jimmy, was probably going to ship off to war, wouldn't it be nice for Norma Jean to have somewhere to live? "Well, how do you feel about that, Norma Jean?" Jimmy asked her. The way he said her name, all the sounds bunched together and voiced like a question, made Norma Jean blush. She looked at Grace, and Grace alone, and asked in front of everybody else whether it would be possible to get married without having sex, at least right away. "Don't worry," said Grace. "You'll learn." Norma Jean stood up and hugged Jimmy, pressing her cheek to his breast in just the way Grace said she should, as Grace and Doc and Bebe and Jimmy's mother and Jimmy himself watched her. Only now she really wanted to inhale him, to treat his body like her home, if a body could ever be a home. Jimmy followed her to her bedroom, where they sat together a couple feet apart on the bed, the door to the hallway left open. And they spoke for a while about what lay ahead, voices low, and how certain Jimmy was he'd be joining the fight overseas. After Pearl Harbor, it was clear what he had to do. As a Lockheed worker, he had received a governmental deferment, but soon enough, he knew, he'd sign up. It felt like there was almost a shiver connecting them, the way when he shifted on the bed, she would feel it underneath her. And neither of them had to say anything to know the other was aware. Norma Jean peered at this brave guy, sitting right in front of the framed photograph on her bedside table of the man who supposedly was her father. Maybe that man was only someone who wanted to look like Clark Gable, as maybe everyone in and around Hollywood was only somebody trying to look like someone else. Maybe Jimmy was about the only guy pleased just to be himself. So she became Norma Jean Doherty. They got married, moved in together, and Grace, Doc, and Bebe left for West Virginia, and Norma Jean gave her virginity to Jimmy, but they were lawfully wedded, and it was fine. Jimmy had a very nice body, a broad chest with red hair, and he was very involved with his physical fitness, dedicating almost as much time to it as Norma Jean did before a mirror. In certain respects, Norma Jean could see that was all Jimmy was thinking about, too. Although he said all that stuff about a man having to be strong and wanting to be capable for the war. She said, "Oh, Jimmy, that's awfully silly. Are you sure you aren't just thinking about your looks? There's nothing wrong with that. You can tell me." He became really stern with her in the way he did when he was cross, and she didn't say anything like that again. He would hold her the way she liked, big spoon to her little spoon, though Jimmy joked there was nothing little about her. Norma Jean loved him very much. She did. She told him she felt safe around him when he held her in the way that she liked. And she loved how he always said her name rushed together like a question. "Norma Jean?" She liked how he smelled, especially after a run, which he was always going out for, even on the hottest days. Norma Jean performed the part of housewife. She cooked Jimmy's meals and poured his drinks. When Jimmy's brother and his brother's fiancée came over, and Jimmy asked Norma Jean to prep their drinks, she went to the fifth of whiskey that Jimmy's brother had left on the counter, with her body blocking the view of the tall glasses because she wanted to get it just right. She measured out the fifth equally between the four glasses, emptying the bottle to the last drop, then adding only about 3/4 of one bottle of Coca-Cola evenly on top, so the glasses were full. Norma Jean brought the drinks over on a tray, and when Jimmy's brother took the first sip, he immediately spit it across the table. How was she supposed to know a thing like how to make a drink if nobody bothered to show her? That same night, as a prank, Jimmy's brother snuck off to the pantry and peeled all the labels from the cans, so that for the next month, she and Jimmy didn't know what they were having. Jimmy would say, "What's for dinner?" And Norma Jean, laughing very hard, would say, "Mystery can." It was funny, wasn't it? How a moment like that could seem to stand for other moments, could draw so much of what happened afterwards right inside of it. How it became almost like a symbol of something that a girl would think back to later with great tenderness and almost longing. But to recognize a symbol like that, and more importantly to feel it, she had to first get outside of it and look back the way she would a moving image. Even if it was only a moving image in her mind, one that she alone of all the people in the world could see. Well, she and Jimmy. He noticed how she spelled his name with an IE at the end. Whenever he wrote his name, usually he wrote James, but he said he'd always thought of himself as a Jimmy with a Y. Well, Norma Jean had changed her name an awful lot too. She had tried on different last names, and even different spellings of her first names. Sometimes Jean with an E, like her mother put it on her birth certificate, and sometimes Jean without an E, as in Harlow. What was the harm in a little changing around? A person could do what they liked, be who they liked. It was easy to end discussions like how a name ought to be spelled by getting near to him. So he showed his pleasure with her and reached for her. It was a pleasure to be held like that in a very strong grip, and afterwards in the quiet of their breathing. When Norma Jean asked Jimmy who he thought she was, he said, "A gentle person, a quiet person, a very sweet and passive person. Sometimes, though, Norma Jean, I think you're like two people. That's the Gemini in you. Sometimes I look and see Norma Jean. Other times, I'm not sure who I see when you look so deep in thought. That's when I worry. I don't know why you go to trouble with so much thinking." He took a photo of her at the zoo in front of two penguins, because penguins were monogamous, and when they mate, usually it's for life, or so Jimmy said. Norma Jean loved Jimmy very much. She did. She started to run just the way that he ran, usually in the mornings while Jimmy was sleeping off at night at Lockheed. He made good money, enough to support them both. She started to lift weights too, little barbells, much smaller than those he used. They went to the movies all the time. Whenever it felt like they didn't have anything to say to each other, they could go to the movies and step outside with a rush of new feelings and look at each other, glowing and in love, even if the movie was about the war. Norma Jean didn't really see any of her old girlfriends anymore, mostly because they were still taking classes at high school. And besides, what could they possibly talk about? Recipes for lemon pie? The best way to ration? How to keep a husband from becoming cross? She turned 16 years old, and Jimmy presented her with a cupcake. Jimmy loved Norma Jean's lemon pie, he said, and so she started to make them all the time. She could follow a cookbook just fine, but her favorite meal was steak, beets, and carrots because of all the canned meals. It was the one with the nicest spread of color. Jimmy laughed at that, but it was true. Why shouldn't the colors matter? One afternoon, he returned from driving around and said he'd gone and enlisted in the Navy, done everything but sign the final papers. Norma Jean cried, and Jimmy got down on the sofa next to her and held her. "You're leaving me," she said to him, surprised at how upset she felt. She repeated it over and over until, very solemnly, Jimmy said, "Then I won't go." A couple of more weeks passed, and Jimmy came to her again and said if he joined the merchant marine, he'd be home more often. All his friends were joining up, and he couldn't stand it, to be left stateside while all his buddies went off to fight. She said yes. She had to, or else she knew Jimmy wouldn't be happy. He signed up with the ship's company, and they made him physical fitness instructor. He and Norma Jean got to live together for several months on Catalina Island in government lodging, and it was just wonderful being that close to the beach. An absolute dream. They posed for a picture together, the two of them, he in his merchant marine uniform with a little white cap and two sailor's ribbons tied at his neck like inverted rabbit's ears, and Norma Jean in a white jumper with her hair done up under a shawl like a much older woman would wear, the at-home war wives Norma Jean had seen in pictures. She told him that she wanted a baby. They were naked and pressed against each other. She told him all at once, "I want you to leave me with a part of you." He blinked and didn't seem to know how to answer, and Norma Jean became conscious of how intensely she was staring at him. It felt as if he were her entire life. A baby would be proof. But he shook his head. "There'll be plenty of time," he said, "after the war." "Please," Norma Jean said, and she could feel the tears welling up. "I can feel it has to be now, Jimmy. I can feel it has to be now for us to have a baby." He eyed her in silence, her naked self, her most confident self, where everything was in the open and there was no need really to pretend about anything, because everything was obvious and right there. "We can't afford it, Norma Jean. It costs enough to keep you in nice clothes. How are we going to support a baby too? Let's wait. Let's wait until I'm home and around the house to help out." Jimmy took a black and white photo of her standing on the beach, with her legs fit perfectly together and her arms extended a little bit from her sides. She was wearing a dress with flowers on it that fit perfectly, a very modern cut, high up on her legs. And in the photo, she looked like a perfect girl, all grown up, like Jimmy's perfect girl. It was the photo he'd take with him while he's overseas. After Norma Jean said goodbye to Jimmy at the port with all the other sailors, and their mothers, and sisters, and girlfriends, she moved in with Jimmy's mother, and Jimmy's mother got her a job at the radioplane factory. It was kind of funny, wasn't it, about Radioplane? The company was owned by a real-life movie star named Reginald Denny, and it was Norma Jean's job to brush dope on the radioplane, which were small aircraft that could fly without a pilot. The military was ordering a whole bunch to use as targets for target practice, and it was Norma Jean's job to use the dope to attach the parachute fabric that would open when one of the small planes got hit and started to fall from the sky. What a thing it was to have her own job, and earn her own money, and not have to rely completely on Jimmy. In a way, it made her feel closer to him. It made her feel more like him, to have thoughts she imagined he must have had too. She wrote a letter to him every day. And she wrote to Grace, who had recently moved by herself to Chicago for film work, separate from Doc. She let Grace know how perfectly in love she and Jimmy had turned out to be, and how grateful she was to Grace for bringing them together. She wrote how much like a mother Grace had been to her, a fact Norma Jean would never, ever forget. Norma Jean had delightful apple cheeks, and eyebrows styled in the latest fashion, and curly brown hair like a doll's hair, all in a mop on her head, and maybe a nose that was a little too big, and a jawline that she felt was a little too round when she compared it to how her favorite movie actresses looked on screen. Living alone with Jimmy's mother and writing letters to Jimmy every day, letters she'd hear back from only a couple of times a month, Norma Jean got to thinking, as the words flooded out of her, about being in pictures, more and more about being in pictures, what an escape it would be from the feelings inside of herself she didn't want. When the Army private showed up at Radioplane one afternoon and asked Norma Jean whether she would like to appear in photographs for an Army magazine, why, she knew someone had been listening to her wishes. The man introduced himself as Private David Conover, sent by Captain Regan's office, and said, without even a moment's hesitation, that the camera loved her. "Norma Jean," he said, stating her name calmly and all spaced out the regular way. "Have you ever thought about going to the modeling profession?" She felt undeniably alive in front of the lens, her lips dry from smiling so much so that she had to re-wet them. David Conover spoke of his wife, said modeling was strictly a business proposition, a way for a girl like Norma Jean to earn a better living. I have a lot of contacts, David Conover said. I'd be more than happy to put you in touch. In touch. Yes, Norma Jean said yes, she loved that. She loved nothing more. David returned the next day to take photographs only of Norma Jean, talking to her the whole time, telling her how lovely she was. He gave her the number for a modeling agency, a business run by a lady named Emmeline Snively. When Norma Jean saw the photographs, she wanted to cry for how beautiful they were in such color. That was her green blouse and long gray skirt, ruby red lipstick, a radio plane ID pinned to her waist as she held up the propeller for the red remote control aircraft. Her curly brown hair, like a doll's hair, and a corona all around her head. That was Norma Jean, completely separate from her sadness, no longer in black and white and alone on the beach, waiting for someone to come home, someone she heard from hardly ever. So even if Jimmy's mother wasn't happy about the photos, or when Norma Jean paid to have her hair straightened and dyed blonde, that was fine. It was Norma Jean's life, not Jimmy's mother's. She couldn't make herself fit into the box of that woman's expectations. In modeling, everything was revealed for what it in fact is, a variety of make-believe. She could call herself whatever she wanted to call herself, and that's how people would speak to her. Jean Norman, or Mona Monroe. Monroe was her mother's maiden name. She waited for word from Jimmy. She waited some more. He was stationed on the Yangtze River outside Shanghai, which she recognized was very far away. But when his next letter finally reached her, and possibly a magazine with her photograph had made it all the way around the globe to him, she couldn't believe it. She was so excited for what he might tell her. It's a tough business, he wrote, probably about the toughest in the world. All the boys here love the pictures. But when I cover your mouth and look only at your eyes, Norma Jean, all I see is sadness. Well, didn't that sound almost like a challenge? Why, how many more pictures she could take, more than Jimmy could possibly imagine. Then let him see, let Jimmy see, whose sadness it really was, how far it could possibly follow.